So you'll see any number of these research papers looking at various gut-brain connections now, but here's one that I just pulled out. The communication pathways between gut microbiota, so another name for the microbiome, and the central nervous system could include autonomic, neuroendocrine, enteric, and immune systems, with pathology resulting in disruption to neurotransmitter balance, increases in chronic inflammation, or exacerbated HPA axis activity. So HPA axis, for those of you who've not heard that before, is the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis, which is an area that they really look at for neurotransmitters being out of balance and what's going on between those various organs and glands. So we can see, neurotransmission is clearly being linked now to the gut bugs, and now the race is on to try to figure out, what is doing what to what, when, and how is really where it's going now. Okay, so we have all this information now. What can we do about it? Hopefully some of you are already, starting a list of a few things in your mind. The important thing, and hopefully you got a bit of this from the first video that we watched too, is that these bugs can cause biochemical cravings in the body. So I always say this jokingly to older women clients that I work with, if they're wanting to lose weight, I say, it's not you, it's your bugs. You can stop being guilty about this because it is about your bugs. And they're finding this, that the microbiome balances are actually very different in people who have a tendency to weight gain. So we can also apply this in this situation. And what do we see our kids craving typically? Shout out a few foods.
Fries.
Yeah, fries. Carbs, Eggo waffles, slushies, yeah, sugar, pop, right? All of these starch-based, sugar-based compounds, right? These are really good reason for that, right? It's helping to feed the bugs that are trying to persist in their body. So it's initially, of course, it gives them a little boost of energy as well, which a lot of them probably feel a bit better on in that moment. But ultimately, the long-term price they're paying for this is that they're constantly feeding bugs that we don't want to be sticking around, and they're also depressing their immune system in the process of doing that because the sugar is depleting them of so many of the nutrients that they need for a robust immune system as well. And then we throw some of these other sweeteners that are around these days, high fructose corn syrup, lots of other sweeteners under lots of other names that can be equally problematic as well, and they love to hide all these sweeteners in names these days. Lots of processed foods, right? And chemical additives. So PPA, what we just watched the video about, is one of these things that is being used as a preservative or some type of additive in the foods. Those are all going to be affecting what gut bugs are sticking around and what gut bugs are not sticking around. And then we run into this issue of complex carbohydrates. And when we talk, the diet that I am going to mostly be recommending, we're going to be looking at this issue of complex carbohydrates because a lot of the kids that I work with have maldigestion issues when it comes to carbohydrates. And I'm not going to go back to the digestion slide, but if you remember in the first stage of the small intestine, that's where carbohydrates should get broken down. That's where most of the action should be. But what we'll see is kids that, they eat a meal and then they're really bloated after maybe 2 hours or so, and some of us here in this room too may experience this. When that digestive reaction takes place any more than kind of, I would say, an hour after eating a meal, and it's more that bloating that crops up a couple of hours after a meal, that's a small intestine issue with digestion. And that's an indication that, there's probably some bug imbalance going on there. And part and parcel of that, there'll also be lowered enzyme production there. So they're not necessarily breaking these carbohydrates down very well. So again, there's a lot we can do about that. So yeah, the end point being that these guys, if we're feeding them, they're going to keep asking for more food, right? They're not going to go away. So we need to stop feeding them. Now, some of you may have heard of Dr. David Perlmutter. He's done quite a number of like PBS specials, and he has a book out recently called Brain Maker. So he's written in that book diets high in sugar and low in fiber fuel unwanted bacteria and increase the chances of intestinal permeability, leaky gut, mitochondrial damage, immune system compromise, and widespread inflammation that reaches the brain. And it's a vicious cycle. All of these effects further assault that microbial balance, and it just keeps going on and on and on. So, we can do things to feed the good bugs, right? So I know that everybody here, right, has heard of probiotics. This is not a new word. Okay, awesome. So probiotics come in the form of supplements, but they also come in the forms of a lot of our traditional foods. So no matter what your cultural background is, all of you, let's say 6 generations ago, your ancestors would have had fermented foods in on a daily basis, if not a meal-by-meal basis. There would have been some fermented food as part of that. Part of that was out of necessity because they needed to preserve the foods without refrigeration, right? So they found ways to get bacteria to preserve these foods. But in other cases, it just became part of the culture. That's what was eaten. So I've given you some very basic examples that we have easy access to here, but any of you who do still, have some access to traditional diets, you're going to find a much wider range of possibilities culturally. The problem is these days, even with things like miso soup, for example, you go to a Japanese restaurant, and that miso should be a properly fermented miso, but very often what you're getting is like a powder that they're just adding hot water to, and there's no probiotics really available in that. Same thing with like the pickled ginger that you get, that would have served a purpose of providing probiotic activity and killing off parasites alongside the wasabi, right? But now you get fake wasabi and you get non-fermented ginger that usually has dye and preservative added to it. And so not only are you no longer protected from parasites in the raw fish that you're about to enjoy, but you're not getting any of that probiotic benefit to help with the digestion as well. So they do, when we eat some probiotic foods, and it doesn't have to be like a giant bowl of sauerkraut. It can be like, initially it can be a little teaspoon of sauerkraut or whatever, pickled carrots, pickled beets, whatever works, right? But they render all the rest of your food at that meal more digestible. So sometimes when people have digestive issues, the key is just to add in some probiotic foods with that meal, and suddenly they find, even without doing anything else, that they're digesting that food a lot better. Again, these guys increase our nutrient uptake from our food, increase the enzyme capabilities, and provide straight up probiotic bacteria for us as well. So lots of good reasons to include these. And then you remember we were talking about the fact that probiotic bacteria like plant fiber as their food source, right? So that's when you've seen the yogurt ads that advertise now with prebiotic and probiotic. Prebiotic is simply the food for the bacteria. So we can naturally provide our bugs with prebiotic by eating vegetables. Pretty much every vegetable has some prebiotic in it. A lot of the root vegetables and things like onions and garlic, just stuffed full of prebiotic capability. So, lots and lots of plant matter is the way to go there, and especially vegetables. This is a really frightening statistic, but about 75% of everything your average person eats in the West, particularly in the US and Canada, is of absolutely no value to our gut bacteria. So only 25% of what we eat is actually sustaining their lives. Whereas if we go back a couple of generations, it would have been pretty much 100% of what we were eating, right? So we look at some of these recent issues, not just autism, but a lot of other issues that have become more prominent, and now maybe we have, somewhat of an answer why. So one of the things that I find when we start feeding the good bugs and we start, adding in some better foods, is that it recalibrates our sense of sweetness. So those of you who think, oh no, I couldn't possibly live without my sugar, my child can't possibly live without their sugar, because I know even though you're here for your kids, this is also going to affect you as well, because you need to manage these changes and decide, like, am I ready to do this for myself as well, right? At least in part. So I just want to share with you that all of the families that I've worked with, and we've certainly experienced within our own family, that when we cut sugar out 100% and we were just eating, small amounts of fruit and honey, that was really sweet. And we can't even eat things anymore. Like, if we go out to a birthday party, we might take a little slice of cake, but I can't eat it because the sweet factor, how my body experiences that now, is so different. And I don't have those bugs to be feeding, so I'm not getting those same cravings. So hopefully you'll be happy to hear that, so your kids won't still constantly be craving the sweets over time. So we really want to look at traditional cultural diets here, right? So that this is an understandable thing. Regardless of your cultural background, there's things you can reach into your own culture that will provide you with a really firm foundation for this kind of diet. I encourage a lot of herbs and spices. So interestingly, herbs and spices, they do jazz up a meal for sure, but most of them have a very positive impact on our gut flora. Our gut flora either loves them or the bad guys hate them. So things like cinnamon and clove, for example, help to keep parasites down in the digestive tract and some bad bacteria. If we're adding oregano into our spaghetti sauces and we're using fresh oregano, that has very strong antibacterial, antiviral benefits as well. So it's a really good idea to, get more practiced at adding these things into your meals if you're not already. The GAPS diet we're going to talk about in a little more detail very shortly. And then we're also going to talk a bit about the coconut ketogenic diet. So these are more set protocols. And I work with both of these as well as everything in between and before. So I'm working with families who are where they are at, and that's going to be different for every single family, and it's going to depend on the age, it's going to depend on whether the child's in school or not in school, it's going to depend on food allergies, et cetera, et cetera. So, but these are two more specific protocols that are out there. So now, the question of gluten and dairy, because it always comes up, right? How many of you have heard that it's best to avoid gluten and dairy? Yeah, so a lot of people in this room, right? And some of you may have gone down that road, and some of you may have been advised otherwise, or it just didn't make sense to you or anything. So hopefully we can clear up the detail of that here. So there in wheat, we're just going to focus on wheat and gluten initially. This is not that recent now, because it was 2000 that a substance named zonulin was discovered. And this was discovered by a researcher named Alessio Fasano. As you can see, he's got pretty high credentials there. And he did not want to find this out about gluten, but he did, despite himself. And what he realized is that every time that somebody eats wheat, this includes all of us, pretty much, actually there's a slight genetic exception, but pretty much all of us, whenever we eat wheat, there'll be a certain amount of leakiness that happens in our small intestine in particular from eating that wheat, okay? And that's the interaction of the wheat with certain bacteria that we have present there. But interestingly, zonulin is something, it's produced by the body, it's produced by cells in the gut, but it can also be produced even without the presence of wheat if there are certain bad bacteria that are there in the gut, okay? So just so that we have a visual on this, and this probably looks really complicated to begin with. So if we look at where the number 1 is over on the left, the zonulin, right? So you see each of these are cells on the wall of the gut here. So this is where our food is passing through here, what's called the lumen of the gut. And so these are food particles here, these orange things. So you can see these cells have a little gap between them, or this one has a fairly big gap between them, right? So what's happening is the wheat's coming in, it's triggering zonulin production in here, which is causing leaking through the gut wall, right? And it goes into the bloodstream, and immediately we get immune system reaction there. And the immune system says, wait a minute, you're not supposed to be in here, you're not fully broken down, we're gonna attack you, and we're gonna send messages to other cells, and we're gonna cause some inflammation going on in there, okay? So the news is not all bad, don't panic. Okay, so that's what it looks like. So the difference between, say, you or your child or somebody else's child has to do with how well you can repair when that situation goes on. How robust is your immune system? What bacteria do you have down in that area of the digestive tract? So a little bit of leakiness happens. You have your muffin at breakfast time, but you have resources there to come in and clean that all up and move on with your day, and there's no big deal as a result of doing that. There is a very small percentage genetically of the population that doesn't actually produce zonulin, but what they're finding now is people produce a zonulin-like substance. So the way it works may be slightly different, but this is by and large true for most of the population. So if we're talking about a child who already has compromised digestion, already has compromised immunity, why would we add this extra burden to their system? That's the question I'd like to pose for you tonight. So we may not tangibly see anything obvious going on the outside. I mean, some people will report they notice a difference when they take their kids off gluten or not. But what I'd like to put out there is, why would we add this extra burden when we know that, at least 99 times out of 100, there is going to be some of this leakiness, immune system involvement going on. And if you don't believe me, look up Dr. Fasano and the whole zonulin connection. You'll see he's got lectures and lectures on it. And he said, if anybody told him that he would be standing up in front of a group of doctors presenting this material, 5 years before he did, he said he would have called them crazy, because he really didn't think there was a problem with gluten. Okay. So there's a couple of other things going on with gluten and dairy. So one is that the proteins that are involved in gluten and dairy, so gluten is the dairy, gluten from wheat primarily, but other gluten grains as well. That's the protein. And then casein is the protein from cow dairy in particular. So what we know is that if these two proteins are not broken down all the way, so small intestine is not operating as it could be, then the structure of the proteins is opiate in structure. So it acts like an opioid, and if the blood-brain barrier and the gut wall are a bit leaky, it means that they can affect the brain. So this is what we witnessed with our son, just to sort of bring it back to a real example. When we took dairy out for our son, even within 24 hours, we saw a completely different child, right? Because he was being affected. What he looked like when he was sort of under the influence of dairy, if you want to call it that, is he looked completely zoned out. He was quite happy, but he was in his own world, and he didn't want to mess with anybody, and he didn't want anybody coming into his world. It was like a nice, soft bubble. And in a way, it's self-medication, what's going on, and it's completely understandable, because he felt better when he was in that place. It's a crazy, chaotic world out there, and this is a way that he can kind of be in a bubble a little bit. So it was really understandable that the kids are going to gravitate toward these foods. But if this process is going on with a lack of breakdown of these foods, then it will quite dramatically in some cases be affecting their brain. So these are the kids where when you pull these out, you may notice a really big behavior difference, as quickly as we did, or within a couple of weeks at least. But if you pull these foods out, you don't notice that difference, it doesn't mean that all is lost, and it doesn't necessarily mean that those foods should not stay out. It means that maybe further investigation is necessary. And then lastly, this is something else that they're looking at with both these foods as well, is that it might not be so much this leaky gut, leaky brain issue that's going on, but it might be that good old vagus nerve that's connected all the way down, where if there's some inflammation happening in the gut from reactivity to gluten or to dairy that we might not necessarily see on the outside, that might be traveling along the vagus nerve, that information that's affecting the brain. So what they're looking at now are a lot of studies where they're seeing as soon as inflammation appears in the gut, it also appears in the brain, and they're able to track that now, which is pretty wild. So this is why I really advocate for some type of allergy or reactivity testing for my clients, just to figure out for sure, how important is it to keep these foods out. But I would say in most cases, it's a really good idea to keep these foods out, at least while you're trying to figure out everything else that's going on digestively, so you're not running the risk of those complicating things. Okay. And you didn't think I was going to let you go tonight without talking about some poop, right? Which is what I spent a lot of my day talking about. So I had a feeling that a question may come up anyway around fecal transplant, because I know, I'm having more and more clients asking me my opinion about it, et cetera. So what fecal transplant literally is literally what you saw in the video, where they are taking a sample from a quote-unquote healthy donor, and they're doing a little sort of mixa with it, cocktail, and then they're inserting it, usually rectally, into kids. And this is happening for a lot of conditions besides autism. It's not just autism. And some parents are seeing phenomenal results with it. They're seeing changes with it, right? They are also now working on an oral administration of basically a fecal transplant. So you're basically saying, okay, let's take this person's microbiome and we'll try adding a bit of that into this person's microbiome and see what happens. Now, inherent in that description, you can see that there might be some, concerns there on all sides, right? We don't actually really know what we're doing with this yet completely, right? Even if people do go and do fecal transplants, and I don't discourage any of my clients from doing this, it's absolutely a possibility. But even if they do you think that microbiome is going to maintain itself without them changing diet? Absolutely not. I'm so glad that you're all on board with that now. There's no way. So any way around it, you're still going to need to do maintenance, right? Whatever sort of treatment that we do here. So again, it all comes back to the diet. So who knows, maybe even 5 years down the road, we'll all be giving our kids, their daily administration when everybody gets a lot more, comfortable with what actually is taking place there. But just so you know, it's a thing, it's out there. It's not going to be happening here at the center anytime soon, I don't think, but it's a thing that you'll encounter. So I just want to talk briefly about the GAPS diet. So I'm trained as a GAPS practitioner, and this was really when we felt like we'd hit it home with our son when we started on the GAPS protocol. So I'm going to be very brief about it tonight, because the one thing I found working with GAPS over the years is that it really does need to be individualized to each person who's on it. So there is a GAPS book out there, fantastic book, highly recommend that you read it. It's just called Gut and Psychology Syndrome, GAPS. You can order it on Amazon. But then that is a general book. And then what my role is to make that really specific to the individual and help, troubleshoot and strategize. Basically what it is, and hopefully it will make complete sense to you now, is that it's grain-free to take out some of the more complex carbohydrates. It's potato-free. It's starch-free for the most part to take those things out. Lots of vegetables, some fruits, so, wide variety of meat, eggs, nuts, seeds. There's some beans that are part of this protocol. Some dairy can be included, but again, that's as you progress along with it, and it depends specifically on allergy. So it might be goat dairy or sheep dairy, for example, if cow dairy doesn't work. No processed sugar at all, honey and fruit. So the goal here is to take out any foods that are going to be taxing the body or taxing the digestive system, taxing the immune system, and putting good stuff in, to feed the microbes and feed the individual and make all of this food really highly absorbable for that individual so that they can replenish their body. So, a lot of you, I can see a few faces kind of going, oh my God, no grains, how would we survive? There's so many great websites, there's fantastic recipe books out there now. One of my hopes here at the center is that I'm going to develop some parent groups as well, so that people would have the ability to kind of get together, share information, share recipes, maybe even like have an evening where people cook together and have potlucks and things like that. I did run a GAPS group early on, and that was a great way for parents to connect and commiserate sometimes, and complain, but, it was all a way of kind of joining on this journey. So the reason why I've got this weird little image up here of beads is just to help us think about this idea of how we have to break down foods. So when we're eating a more complex carbohydrate like a grain or a potato, we have to understand that each one of these beads represents a sugar molecule, and each of these are joined together very tightly to the other sugar molecules. And in order to break these apart into individual beads, we have to use digestive enzymes. So if we're deficient in digestive enzymes, or we're still at the outset, we really don't want to send a carbohydrate looking like that into the digestive tract, because it's asking for a lot digestively from the body. So what we want to do is go with the more simple carbohydrates like honey, like fruit, but we're going to combine those with food that's not going to mean that our blood sugar shoots up. So we're going to combine them with, some almond butter or, some meat or something like that, so that we don't get these big problems with blood sugar. But we want to keep the carbohydrate as simple as possible for that reason, so that everything's getting digested, because those nasty bugs, the candida yeast, the parasites, and pathogenic bacteria love nothing more than sugar molecules to eat. And if we don't digest it fully, it starts to ferment in the digestive tract, and there's a big smorgasbord for all of the bad bugs down there. So that's what we're trying to avoid. So this is kind of one step further, but I wanted to introduce this tonight. There's a new kind of diet out there called the coconut ketogenic diet. So I think before we talk about the diet, let's clear up what a ketone is as part of the ketogenic diet. So there's this really great graphic where basically you see over here, these are ketones. So basically what happens is we normally run on glucose, right? That's our fuel that we use, and that's what our brain uses typically for its fuel too. But when our body runs out of glucose, whether that's by accident, we went to work and we didn't take our lunch with us or whatever, or whether it's on purpose, which we're looking at, our liver starts to kick into gear, and it starts producing a different form of energy in the form of ketones, which we can run on. So you can think of it as being like ultra premium gasoline. So glucose is like the unleaded, the cheapest gasoline. Ketones are the most expensive premium gasoline. And the reason for that is there's not a lot of problematic byproducts from the use of ketones, right? But this is a very specific therapeutic purpose. So some of you may have gone to your doctor before and seen, oh, there were ketones in your urine. That's not a good thing. Or you think of ketones in a negative light, because it's true. If somebody is eating an average diet with a reasonable level of carbohydrates, if they do a urine test at the doctor and there's ketones in their urine, that's not a good sign, right? But it's only not a good sign because it's saying there's a problem with carbohydrate metabolism, not the ketones themselves being the problem, if that makes sense. So it's this super fuel. And we need fat in order to create ketones. So it's fat metabolism. So when the body starts to run out of its own excess stores, it looks to dietary fat as the provider for the ketones. The brain is very, very well served by ketones. And this protocol is being applied these days not only to autism, but also to Alzheimer's, to dementia, to MS, to Parkinson's, anything involving the central nervous system. And there's really some amazing studies going on around this right now. So interestingly, it stimulates extra blood flow to the brain, and so that brings with it extra oxygen in the red blood cells. And one of the things we know is there's a lot of problems with oxygen utilization for our kids. So we can think of these ketones as being neuroprotective. So what we see is when the gut is inflamed and the brain is inflamed, it actually stops being able to use glucose very well at all. And we can get a lot of insulin resistance, so the kids can get diagnosed with diabetes as time travels along, right? And this is where this type of diet really comes to the fore, because we can say, okay, glucose isn't working for this person right now, or it's actually worsening the picture. Well, we don't have to use that fuel. We can actually shift over to using ketones. Now, one thing I should say is both the GAPS diet that I just talked about and this protocol are considered therapeutic diets. So they're not intended to be lifelong. For those of you who are thinking, oh my God, how long do we have to do this, right? Most of them are, or most people who follow these will use them therapeutically for a period of time and then transition back onto a healthy, but normal healthy diet, right? There are some cases, and I won't go into the details, but there are some cases where I would probably suggest certain individuals stay on them mostly for life, depending on the degree of damage or their age or things like that. But for most, especially kids we're talking about, they'll be able to transition off them. So they found that ketones activate something in the brain called brain-derived neurotropic factors. And these are the things that help us repair the brain, basically, which is super cool that we've been able to identify these now. And we can stimulate extra production of things that are going to help the kids repair their brain and regrow neural connections as well through this diet. So the take home on this is reducing inflammation and regenerating brain cells at the same time. So the ketones provide these basic building blocks. And when we first give birth, that's actually what our babies survive on, right? So they're taking breast milk, but generally their brain is building itself on ketones, not on glucose. Just kind of interesting. So if we're trying to rebuild the brain, putting it back into that state seems to be having a lot of effect. So what are we looking at in terms of, the spectrum of foods? High fat, low carbohydrate, moderate protein. So we're not really shifting the protein. Where we're shifting things from a normal diet is we're going much higher with the fats and much lower with the carbohydrates. So there's no nutrients missing if this is done properly. But you do need to be knowledgeable about this diet. It's not something that you just sort of quickly look up on the internet and decide to employ the next day, right? Because we do want to be careful. There's a few factors involved here. Coconut oil is our friend here, and I'm sure all of you, coconut oil seems to be everywhere these days, and this is one of the reasons for this rise of popularity. So again, with this diet, we're looking at reducing inflammation, feeding good bugs, and doing a lot of repair and regeneration in the brain. So there are some challenges for sure, right? I'm sure you already have this picture of your child in your mind around this, right? So of course, there's an initial transition period, and I've just been through this so many times now with so many families that I want to tell you all, there absolutely is a light at the end of the tunnel, and it's really up to you as parents to facilitate that. Where there's a will, there's a way. If you are determined that you're going to get through this, I guarantee you are stronger than your will can be stronger than your child's will. And some of our kids can have really, really strong wills, and they can be really stubborn. But absolutely, sometimes there can be transitions that are more dramatic. So if somebody has a very high level of pathogenic microbes and parasites and yeast, and you take away all the foods that feed those bugs, well, those kids are not going to be too happy for a couple of days. Usually day one is the unhappy, like they're tugging at you and saying, why can't I have my cheesies or whatever, my goldfish crackers or whatever it is. And then on day two, day three, what that upset looks like is they're laying on the couch and they look like they have the flu. And that's because there's a lot of detoxification, a lot of bugs transitioning in their system. So it's all good. And that's where, I provide people with the tools that they need to feel secure going through that. But in some cases, that's inevitable with the kids. So there's a few bumps in the first week or so, and then it's smooth sailing from there on. As parents, we have to get much better at meal planning and food preparation. And that was where I found oh my God, this is a whole new thing for me, but it really helps take the stress off when you do that. And then the other thing that can be a big challenge is, if you're a couple, one of you thinks this is a good idea, one of you thinks this is a really bad idea. One of you feels guilty for depriving your child of the goldfish crackers, the other one says, no way, man, we're doing this, right? it's an issue for sure. I encounter this all the time. So we have to try to use education to get everybody on the same page. And then you have well-meaning auntie or grandma or, visiting friend who says, oh, that's so mean that your child's not, let me just give them one cookie, and you're going, no, I've been working on this for 2 weeks, right? So this is something that plays out. And then there's community support, right? You might be taking your kids for therapy somewhere where they always have a bowl of candies on the front counter or whatever. So, I know that this is going to change over time. I applaud you for being here tonight because you're kind of at the forefront of this wave of dietary change that's happening for the kids. But absolutely, it's still really difficult out there. We're encountering chocolate bars and candies and pop and birthday cake at birthday parties and pizza and everything. And so you just have to, get as many supportive people around you as possible. Then there's, traveling. That can be a challenge. I've had some families making, soup from bones on their camp stove. They went on a camping holiday. So people have done pretty amazing things. I think Mike, who's doing my video tonight, you guys even went on a camping trip with your 3 kids, right? And we're following these type of protocols as well. So it's totally doable, and there are restaurants these days, thank goodness for paleo, because paleo came along at just the right time for some of these types of diets as well, because there's a lot of restaurants out there where you can ask for a paleo-friendly meal, and that's generally gonna work as well. So yeah, it's heading in the right direction. And then I just wanted to say quickly about a standard gluten-free diet. So that's great. If you leave here tonight and you think, okay, the one thing I'm going to do is take gluten out of my child's diet, that's great. Just know that a lot of those gluten-free products out there are full of sugar and starch and color, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this is where just going gluten-free is not actually a really ideal thing to do. I mean, I'm not saying don't take out the gluten. Absolutely. If that's your first step, that's great. But it's really looking at, okay, if you're not ready to go grain-free, which I'm sure you're not, but if you're not, then it's like, okay, well, maybe we start using rice or we do rice crackers or something. So just be careful of a lot of those, happy-looking gluten-free products out there because they're really not very nutritious at all. Okay, so what are our rewards from doing this, right? Sounds like a lot of work, sounds like a big challenge, absolutely, right? But any investment is gonna, an investment like this is really gonna give you back hugely, right? So it's a recalibration of taste. It's such a lovely thing for me to hear back from my parents. It's so amazing. My child is excited when I give them cut up apple now. Like this was a kid who was screaming for, whatever their starch treat of choice was previously. And they just go, this is so awesome. Or I'm out at the grocery store with them and they say, can we get a banana or something like that? And that's their treat. And then meanwhile, the little kid beside them is saying, but why can't I? And so it really does completely change the sense of food within a family. It's a really amazing thing. So as part and parcel of that, there's actually a lot less household stress in general. Yes, there can be some stress about meal planning and preparation and, oh my goodness, I need to stay up late and prepare this for their lunch tomorrow, for sure. I'm not going to kid you on that. But it just means, if little Johnny is now going to bed at 9:30 and not at 1, or it's so many different scenarios that I'm sure you can imagine in your own household. You can see really big gains in so many different areas there. It's also the best foundation for any other therapies, and this is something I hear back every single client. My speech and language therapist said that things have really been moving along since we started doing this dietary change. You will see everything else magnified in all the other therapies that you're doing just for that reason alone. I mean, and some of you are spending a lot of money on other therapies as well, right? This is going to maximize what you're doing. And then, the big one for all of us as parents is wanting to see improvements in symptoms. So this is, a list off the top of my head of what I see improvements and often complete resolution in usually a fairly short space of time. And it is going to depend. It's going to depend on the child. It's going to depend on their age. It's going to depend on the commitment to, what is being followed dietarily. But none of these are like out there. These are all things that I see time and again with the kids that I work with. So I'm sure you can all find something or several things up there to connect with. So I wanted to leave you with some action steps for tonight to consider anyway, right? So what about just introducing probiotic foods, right? And probably not, standard cow's milk yogurt, hopefully, after our talk about dairy. You could consider a probiotic supplement as well. I usually recommend at least 25 billion colony-forming units is what they're measured in. So if you look at the label on the back, it'll usually say CFUs. That's a therapeutic dose. You could go much higher than that, but that's where I'd say is a starting point. Consider removing sugar, or at least limiting it extremely, but don't expect to see huge symptom change from taking out 50% of the sugar that's in there, right? It needs to be a pretty full commitment. See how you might be able to sneak in more vegetables if that's a challenge. So, I've had parents cook and grind up vegetables within meatballs so that the kids, if they're really picky and if they see something green that's off their plate, find ways of sneaking it in, or creatively making smoothies. So that's why I say sustainably. See what works for you, and just find, again, where there's a will, there's a way. There's lots of testing options. Tonight's talk, it's a whole other talk on that kind of thing. But especially food reactivities is something I encourage, almost everyone to try. There's certain things I know of that come up again and again, food-wise. So it's not always necessary. If somebody's willing to say, okay, well, tell me what are the top 4 foods I should remove, I will absolutely work in that way too. Consider removing cow dairy and gluten, and I put 100% there because so many people say, oh, I tried gluten-free, it didn't work. And then when I actually really have a detailed conversation with them, they didn't realize their child was actually consuming something with gluten in it at least once or twice a day as well. So it can take a bit to figure out what's in everything as well. So know that you have to be super vigilant to really see a difference there. And then possibly down the road, consider moving into one of these more structured protocols, which is really, I have to say with all the kids that I work with, it's really where I see the biggest rewards coming back. Okay. And just for you guys who are here tonight, I just want to say that this is going to be the best foundation for sure, and individualizing it is going to get you much further ahead than just kind of picking up a book and running with it. Know that it's always possible. You could give me any story, and I'll tell you that it's possible that we can get around it. And I have so many parents, and I'm sure some of you are thinking of this, that say to me, my child will only eat all the things that were on your things that we need to remove list. This is going to be impossible. And I say, no, you're telling me what every parent tells me at the first appointment. Know that. So it is possible. It absolutely, it's up to you. So if you're determined, because you're the ones that are holding the reins, or if your therapist who's here tonight, thank you for being here. First of all, this is information that you can pass on to your parents as well, that it absolutely, success is totally possible. So that was our tour through digestion. Anybody who's here tonight who would like to book a free 15-minute phone appointment, you can do that with me. You can do that by calling the Pacific Autism Center number there, the 604-207 number, and they'll book you in for a time, and I will give you a call, and we can talk further.